do you represent government, civil society, private sector, an international organization or university, or maybe something else? Okay, great. So we have a big representation from civil society organizations and NGOs. Also, universities and knowledge institutes are greatly represented today, private sector, government as well. So great. So we have a really diverse audience from different regions and different geographies, and also representing many sectors. Great. Thank you for being with us today. And let me now kick off the discussion with the first round of questions to our panelists. So first of all, I wanted to address the first question to Tommy, as you were co-authoring the research, on the update of the chapter on land ownership. Can you perhaps share with us the main findings of your research? So what did you find that had changed in the last 3 or 4 years in the open data and land?
Thank you, Laura. Welcome to everybody that's here. I'm going to try to be brief and succinct. So, it's a large area, but I think one key change that we have seen over the last 4 years is that the links between the open data community and the land community has developed, has improved, and the gap has shrunk. And I think this is a very important change that has taken place, because I think that strengthening of the relationship recognizes the need for a mutually beneficial relationship that enables work across sectors. I think something else that has matured, if one can use that term, is the understanding of open data in the land sector being less about opening data for its own sake, but that it should be about data that is useful. What is the use of the data? And because there's so little open land data, it's easy to get excited, to be enthusiastic about simply opening up data. But I think this mature understanding makes us realize that I think we need to ask the questions: what is the data to be used for? What service is it enabled? And what is the purpose of the data? So I think that's an important understanding that has developed as well over the last 4 years. In terms of key findings, I want to highlight just very briefly, I think 5 key findings over the last 5 years. The first one is a growing number of stakeholders that have focused initiatives on land data and prioritized land data. In 2018, the link between land data and open data, or land administration and open data, was described as relatively new. That has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and that's, I think, a very good thing. We're looking at initiatives from OGP, GDB, the Land Portal, ODC, even FIG at their last conference had a theme on open data for the land sector. So it's really changed the perspective. The second key trend that we see from 2018 has been ongoing work on the development and the measuring of development of benchmarks, the measuring of openness, the measuring of land data, and tools to uncover and open land data. So there's been a lot of work that has gone into that. The GDB has partnered with the Land Portal to develop the land module. I think Nicholas is really going to talk about that. ILC has a major new strategy focusing on community data, and benchmarking and measuring open land data is a key area of progress since 2018. And I think it's going to continue to be an area of focus going forward. Thirdly, as I've mentioned, the emphasis has been away from opening data to understanding how to use, access, and share data, create value about data, create services. And this is linked to an increasing emphasis on the discussion about equity and justice, human rights in opening up land data and what that means for society. And I think this is also a fantastic development. There continues to be a lot more research done on the use and impact of open land data, how it can support, promote social and economic development. And I think this is also a very positive trend that we see from 2018. And then maybe on a little more technical level, we see continuous efforts to improve open data standards, infrastructures, and this has continued to be developed, especially with a focus on the land data sector. So I think what we are seeing here in the last 4 years is really making explicit the links between open data and land initiatives, and understanding and efforts to understand also what open data means for the land sector. And I think that's a really crucial development. So I'm going to leave us with that. I think we'll get back to some of these topics again as we go through this discussion, Laura.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Thank you. Thank you for this, for sharing this interesting findings. And yes, as anticipated, more than really a revolutionary change and increase in the number, the availability, and accessibility of data. What we have seen perhaps is a different approach, from both the data community, the open data community, and the land community. More interest, more awareness, more dialogue, discussion, collaboration, perhaps, and more also a nuanced understanding, and attention to the idea also of monitoring and benchmarking helps for sure, have a better understanding, but also a broader participation of different stakeholders. And this brings me to the next question, to our next panelist. So again, the State of Open Data chapter in 2019, but also these new findings, Pamela, they concluded saying that we need to continue working to understand, a little bit better what are the conditions for really making data more open and accessible, and what can create, and what are the conditions to creating really opportunities, especially for the most marginalized and disadvantaged groups. How can we really empower these groups by increasing access and use of data so they can, for instance, make their claims or seek more justice, for access to land. So tradition, we hear from past experiences, that sometimes opening up data created some threat instead of really supporting these communities and creating real opportunities. How far do you think that open data ideas have progressed in that sense, to really address this power relation, power dynamics, and the risk of increasing inequalities, and really bring more justice?
Thank you, Laura. I think it's a really important time to advance this question and to ask further and hard questions about equitable and fair for whom. One of the opportunities and also challenges with open data work is that you've got this inextricable relationship between public and private sector interests with open data. And historically, it's been private sector interests who've lobbied the hardest and advocated the most for open data release, in part to support innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think that the folks who are gathered here, and I suspect many of the people who've joined us on this webinar today, may have more interest in open data as a means of trying to deliver a more open, transparent, and accountable government, maybe as an input into civic innovation as well. And so, trying to disaggregate the private sector interest from the public sector interest is really important, and also trying to create space for civil society interests and individual community interests to come to the fore really matters. We need to really make sure that the people who are doing the open data leadership work aren't making assumptions on behalf of community, right? The rallying cry from the disability studies movement is nothing about us without us. And I think that that value is one that the open data community needs to internalize as well. We shouldn't be making paternalistic assumptions around which data sets can help certain communities of people. Similarly speaking, how do we know that releasing a data set has the potential to have harm? You don't know what you don't know. And so one of the things that we really need to start to continue to build is a dynamic relationship between community and the people doing the open data leadership work. The challenging part, of course, is that we want these kind of broad brushstroke solutions. And I think that we can embed these values of tackling issues like power, inequality, and justice in broad open data and open government principles. But the reality is how those things trickle down to communities where real people live really varies quite widely. And so we need to find ways to invest in communities so that they have the capacity to participate in processes. We need respectful and responsive processes when community members raise concerns, that those concerns are actually listened to and acted upon. And we need to make sure that we're building the relationships with community members before we go ahead and release the data sets. It's very difficult to take something back once it's opened. And so the process of raising everyone's awareness around where potential harm may come from is a fluid and dynamic one, but one that needs to start long before somebody switches on the open data portal and puts the work out. The last thing I'll just say is that as we start to see the entrance of more kind of tech innovation folks into the open data space, like the blockchain people, we need to really be careful and ask ourselves questions about whose interest do they have in mind, and also who's bearing the responsibility for the risk in technologically innovative systems, right? We can't always work in an innovation ecosystem where we're waiting to see if what we did has a negative impact. We have to develop better foresight and capacity along the way. Thanks.
Very good point, Pamela. Thank you so much. And of course, we fully agree with you. No, open data for public good, yes, but public good is not a universal assumption, right? And bringing those people around the table to have data-focused conversation is really a must. Then what it takes to have this conversation, capacity building, data literacy, this is all a conversation that we should all have. But how much do we know about land data, open land data? Nicolas, over to you. The open data chapter in 2019 concluded that we need a better baseline, monitoring of data and the level of openness around the world in relation to cadastral data, the land registry, but also land deals. We need a better understanding for our advocacy purposes. So what has changed since when the Global Data Barometer was launched this year in the public space? What new opportunities has it created, but also challenges perhaps? Over, Nicolas.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for joining this discussion. Well, firstly, I would like to briefly summarize the Global Data Barometer for people that doesn't know it, because it's very related on the things that we are going to say regarding the measurement and assessment of the open data regarding land. So the Global Data Barometer is a global study that measures the state of data for public good at the country level, and it's the successor study of the Open Data Barometer. And in the first edition, the GDB assessed 109 countries, and the results were released early this year. That you can find all the results and everything in open data format in globaldatabarometer.org website. And the way in which the barometer assesses the countries is breaking down the concept of data for public good into 4 main dimensions. We assess data availability, data governance, data capabilities, and data use and impact. For this first edition of the Global Data Barometer, we added a land module. In the Open Data Barometer, there was an indicator that, as you mentioned, Laura, was tracking the availability of open cadastries and open registries. And we take the opportunity of the Global Data Barometer to have a more comprehensive approach. So we have 3 indicators regarding land data. One indicator that tracks the availability on land tenure, another one that tracks the availability of land use data. And then we are collecting examples on how land data was used to advocate for a more inclusive land policy. And I have to say that this module on the GDB is very, very important because it's interrelated with many other modules, because we know that land governance issues interact with challenges regarding environment, economic development, social development, etc. So it's interrelated with a lot of other modules on the Global Data Barometer. So going more straightly into your question, I would like also to say that the land tenure indicator of the Global Data Barometer was built to capture more different types of information regarding the relationship of people with land, and not only focus on cadastres and registries. So it made it, we have more varied examples of how countries are releasing this kind of data. However, we have found that the trends are really similar. This is one of the worst performing indicators in the Global Data Barometer. So land tenure data is one of the less opened. However, we have seen interesting trends to compare, for example, the availability of existing land use and land tenure. And we have found, for example, that there is some kind of land use data in almost 80 countries around the world. However, land tenure data is only on half of them. But when we go to the assessment of the quality of that data, we see that regarding land tenure, only 11 data sets could qualify as open data. But when we go to existing land use, 30 of them could be, only half of them. So there is still a lot to do. So regarding existing land use, we have seen that there is interactive maps or information in PDF or other formats, but there's not that many machine readable formats to reuse this data. And I think that this goes along with what the panelists had mentioned previously, of with purpose you open data and how do you improve the reuse of this data, not only open by default. And in land tenure data, we found that the landscape is mixed, it's varied a lot around the world. We have in some places where you have some paywords or you have to do some request of information. And there is this challenge measuring, okay, we need granular data on land tenure. However, it has to be balanced with privacy issues and with different challenges that arise. And just to finalize this intervention, what the Global Data Barometer also proposed, the Global Data Barometer proposed as a new opportunity is that we are tracking different kinds of land tenure. For example, we identified if the data available comprises state-owned land or private-owned land, open access, etc. And what we have detected is that the state-owned land is the one that is more available. And in the lower space of the table, we find the indigenous land and or marginalized population land that is not so made available. So I think that these kind of insights could be very interesting to identify ways to move forward and also to identify challenge. Where are the challenges to open and to share land data?
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Thank you for these great insights. Of course, not much data available, but at the same time, we really needed this granular and nuanced overview of how land data is accessible, and to also understand better all the different data types that are important for this sector, such as now the different tenure types, etc. Really great work, and it's also nice all the case studies that you are collecting on the impact that this data can have whenever they are made openly available. Let's a question to Kristen, to our colleagues from OGP now. We want to hear your perspective, of course, as well, particularly regarding to what extent donors and governments, who are supposed to be the big investors, in the data technical infrastructures for land governance, including digitization of records, how much open data has been kind of a part of these investments. We hear from the 2019 land chapter that in spite of a big amount of money being invested in this technical infrastructure, very few data was made openly available. So it doesn't mean that all data should be open, but at least the system should be open data ready. So in this kind of a framework, can you perhaps share with us what is the approach the OGP has and where OGP countries have made most progress recently in opening up land ownership or land data more in general, and where there is still a lack of progress? Kristen, over to you.
Thank you. So I just want to start by giving a quick overview of what OGP, the Open Government Partnership, is for those of you who don't know. So OGP is a platform that was started in 2011, and we have 77 member countries and now over 100 local governments who work together with civil society, academics, all types of stakeholders to co-create commitments that they implement ambitious reforms to make governments more transparent, more accountable, more participatory. And so Pamela brought up a really good point earlier about how, in terms of land data, we need to not just rely on open data experts or government experts, but also solicit opinions from community members and bring in their thoughts on what data needs to be released or should be released, or what reforms in the area of land governance are most pressing. And so the OGP model is a really great platform for bringing in these opinions from community members, not just relying on what the government thinks should be done. So bringing in opinions from all different types of stakeholders. And so that actually has been done over the last 10 years using OGP. Members have made over 125 commitments related to land governance and spatial planning. And so most of these commitments focus on greater transparency, and around a third of them have referenced specifically open data principles. And so we know that this the OGP platform works for bringing these reforms to life. And so we actually know that they are even better than many other OGP commitments, because 1/3 of commitments related to land governance have achieved strong early results, which is significantly higher than the average rate for all OGP commitments. So it's a particularly bright spot within OGP is working on land. But within this larger group of land governance commitments, a small number of these commitments are actually related to transparency of information on land ownership. So that is an area that we focused on within OGP's newest report that we just launched a couple of months ago, and it's called Broken Links, Open Data to Advance Accountability and Combat Corruption. And so it specifically focuses on open data, but how this can lend to an anti-corruption perspective. And so we focus on this land data that was collected by the Global Data Barometer that Nicholas just provided a great overview of. But we look at this data and how it can be integrated into an anti-corruption perspective. And so we know that lots of reforms have been done through the OGP model, but how are OGP countries now actually doing in publishing land data? And we find that, like Nicholas said, not a lot of countries are publishing very high quality data on land ownership. So just over half of OGP countries are currently publishing some kind of information about land ownership online, but information is not very high quality. So the content of the information is often lacking. For example, in terms of an anti-corruption perspective, information on the beneficiaries of land ownership is scarce. So the people that are actually holding the land, we don't have a lot of information on the names of people or the legal owners of land. And this is an issue in terms of anti-corruption because it can allow corrupt actors to hold their wealth in land and enable tax evasion and money laundering. And so getting this information out there where possible when privacy concerns are also addressed is really important, because we are able to uncover a lot of acts of corruption in terms of holding assets in land. Where land ownership data is available right now in OGP countries, again, like I said, the content is lacking, but also the format is also an issue. So in most cases, few countries are publishing land data in machine readable format, or making it bulk downloadable, or even updating the data regularly. And this is an issue for the public to be able to actually use this data for analysis and uncovering and flagging these cases of corruption. So there's a lot of progress to be made, but luckily the OGP platform is a great spot for highlighting these reforms and co-creating commitments with stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you. So broken links, open data to advance accountability and combat corruption is open for you to consult and read, which is a nice link to the next round of question, where we really want to explore the issue of open data for what purpose, no? For which is the goal, what we want to tackle, no? By opening land data, and of course, anti-corruption and transparency is a fundamental driver for open data. But we see that in many occasions involving the government in discussion is so important. In this sense, OGP is doing a great job with moving forward the open data agenda at country level. But just keeping the focus on government and their major role, no, as a data custodian, we know that they are the major custodians of land data. What other opportunities exist, to create value for government in opening up land data? I want to ask this question to Tommy.
Thank you, Laura.
Let me just remind the audience to keep posing your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I see some exchanges in the chat. Please, if you have questions, put your questions on the Q&A, and we will try to address your questions at the end of this panel conversation. Thank you. Over to you, Tommy.
Thank you, Laura. I think Nicholas talked about the Global Data Barometer, and one of the things that we saw from the results of the Global Data Barometer was that governments, where land data, the little land data that was available, where it was made available, it was actually largely through the action of governments. So governments still have a big role to play in this ecosystem, in opening land data. And I think that necessitates us to deal with the question of, well, how do we create value for government in this question? And I think one of the developments that we have seen is about linking the open data questions and perspectives to land administration functions, and asking the question, how can we improve land administration by making data available? And that means we have to understand open data in the context of land administration, in the context of the services that land administration providers are expected to provide. And I think this has been an interesting development by looking at open data and understanding that from the perspective of land data, and focusing and understanding it in the context of the functions like land use, land development, land tenure, and land value and taxation, and linking these issues together and making it about an issue of service provision, of public service by the government. And I think that there's also a lot of research that points to open data products. This might be a more private sector perspective, but it speaks to the same need for communities or for business to create value around the data. And this is not necessarily financial or commercial value, but in other words, answering the question, what benefits do we have for government? And we see the ODC has moved their strategy from, I think it was open data to publishing with a purpose. We see that in September, the UN General Assembly published and had a high-level session, the 77th session on data with a purpose. This was 22 September. So I think that really starts answering the question about how do you create value? And I think government as a key stakeholder, it answers that question. How do you create value for government in terms of the open data regime? Because I think it's also important to move away from a perspective where society is seen only as in opposition to government. We need to understand that society, the private sector, civil society can also work in cooperation with government. So one of the other aspects that I want to emphasize here is the need for data to actually inform better decision-making, better policy-making. And also, I will quote again from the GDB results, we have seen that even where data is available, often it is not used to inform decision-making. And so it's not, I mean, it's valuable that communities are using data to lobby governments, but we should ask the question as well and create value through saying, well, how can community data, private sector data, feed into a data ecosystem that is used for better decision-making, not only for lobbying or enhancing a particular agenda, but broadening the scope of perspectives that go into the decision-making processes. Now, this would require community, the private sector, all of them to cooperate in creating value in this cooperation for all sectors, for all stakeholders. And this requires trust so that we can take community data and have it part of government data. This requires trust from all parties, which I think is important. Very quickly, I think another aspect to create value is the use of open data standards that allow non-government data to be integrated into the system so that we don't have private data or community data sort of standing on the sidelines, but that it can actually be incorporated. And I think here open data standards can create that opportunity and create value around that. And then finally, I think the last aspect I want to emphasize is we have seen from research that open geospatial data portals are significantly underutilized globally. We see that public and private data organizations who invest in open data often do so with the perspective of that it's the right thing to do, but not having a clear idea of how to create value or services from those initiatives and making the necessary investments to create that value for the community or to create those services that should be added onto that. And I think so expanding that idea of not simply making open data available because it's the right thing to do, but also thinking of the corresponding investments to actually create value from those open data initiatives is going to allow a wider audience to access, contribute, and benefit from this data revolution that we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Thank you. So open land data for what purpose? And you made it very clear that this purpose could also be supporting the government in their land administration functions. And in this regard, the land portal, you are doing a great job by developing together with the ODC, the Open Up Guide for government. So a clear pathway to opening up land data to improve land administration systems and services. Thank you for these examples and for these insights, Tommy. And also, Nicholas, can you share with us some stories of impact, on how the use of data, of land data and information has improved decision-making or policy-making from the Global Data Barometer fundings?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Yes, as we mentioned before, the Global Data Barometer track the uses of land data, specifically to address or to inform policy making for a more equitable land ecosystem. And I have to say that we also have measured, for example, what kind of institutions or people was using and publishing things with land data. And we saw that the sector that is most using it is the civil society, which is playing a very huge role there. And then it was followed by academia, and then the media and the private sector. So I think that this is also related with what Pamela and Tommy were mentioning of opening data with a purpose. And we have to bear in mind that, like, we know that every society has a relationship with land and its development, but this relationship is very different according to the place of the world where we are because of historical, economic, or cultural aspect. And I think that this concept of opening with purpose could be a very interesting link to this global issue with the local particularities, and to have in mind the needs and the nuances of the communities affected, that analyze on the light of these needs, of these purposes of opening data, is going to make us have more data and better data opened. And regarding the examples that you mentioned, Laura, I don't want to focus particularly in one of them. I want to invite the people again to go to globaldatabarometer.org and to see the results in the report and also download the open data. But yes, I would like to highlight some of the approaches that different stakeholders have using land data. There are interesting examples, for example, in Paraguay, where people were connecting different sources of data. They used some little available official records, but they complemented with satellitary images to create reports on land use and land change. And for example, in Brazil, there were different land use cases to track land ownership concentration and agricultural policy. And there was built a map of inequality that used record from more than 5 million rural properties. And so they had different inputs to create this analysis and to also in many cases display it in a visual way to be understandable and to advocate for a more fair land governance. And also a last comment on also to think about how land data can be released to foster the reuse of the data. We know that machine readable and reusable formats are key, right? And they have to be there, but also with this kind of data that sometimes you need a technical knowledge, you know, to understand and to analyze a huge data set of geographical, geospatial data. You need technical knowledge to work with it. And some stakeholders that doesn't count it. So we have also seen very interesting examples where interactive maps or dashboards, real-time dashboards are presented from official records. And for example, the Rwanda Land Administration Information System has a very interesting dashboard where you can analyze for example, the gender of people owning owning land, or which proportion of the land is owned by companies or by natural people. So with just a few clicks, you can have a lot of value from data that is already collected. And the last concept I want to mention to you is also related with what Tommy was mentioning regarding the functions of the land administration system, and that all these functions are interrelated. So again, thinking about opening with purpose. Generally, oftenly, when you identify the purpose for the opening the land data, you will find that land tenure or land ownership data by itself is not enough. You might need information on transactions, and that will not be enough. You might add the layer of existing land use or past land use or land land cover. So all this information is interrelated, and we must take that into consideration, again, when we think opening with which purpose and to benefit of which communities.
Great. Great, very nice examples. Nicholas, this is exactly what the land community needs to advocate for, more open land data. So it's, and also all these examples, it's very nice to hear that the biggest group that use land data when they are openly available is the civil society groups. And because this resonates very much with also what we have found, no, and among our partners and in the land sector. So when communities, indigenous groups or communities or civil societies start engaging with data, there is a process of increased participation and empowerment, you know, that happens. And they feel more legitimate in also talking to governments and administrations. So very much useful insights. Thank you, Nicholas. But land data can also be used for anti-corruption purposes, Kristen, when they are openly available. Yes, do you have examples on that?
Yeah, so when we talk about opening land data with a purpose, obviously anti-corruption is not the first thing that comes to mind for most people, but land data is a critical part of this puzzle when it comes to detecting and curbing corruption. And as I mentioned before, without transparency of land ownership, for example, it's a lot easier for corrupt actors to hide their wealth and their assets in land. However, for the purposes of anti-corruption, land data is not enough on its own, right? We need a variety of government data sets. For example, procurement data, beneficial ownership data, public officials' asset declarations. We need all this data, and we need it to be interoperable. That's the key, is that we need land data sets to be interoperable with these other data sets. We need them to use common identifiers so that we can create these links. And that's why OGP's report is called Broken Links, because we find that in most cases, data might be available in a lot of these countries, but the data is definitely, in most cases, not connected, not linked together. Countries are not using common identifiers when they're publishing these data sets, and likely because different agencies are publishing different data sets. But the critical piece in order to detect cases of corruption is to be able to link these data sets together. So just as a quick example of where land ownership data can come into play in detecting corruption, I'll share like a high level story, which many of you are probably familiar with, is the Andrej Babiš story in the Czech Republic. And so he's the former prime minister of the Czech Republic, and he was caught committing subsidy fraud, where he was the owner of the largest agricultural conglomerate in the Czech Republic. And in order to gain these EU agricultural subsidies, which were meant for small agricultural farms, he split off a small piece of his giant conglomerate into one little company. So he was able to gain these subsidies. And once he got these subsidies fraudulently, he filtered the money through a bunch of shell companies and then bought a chateau in France. And the only reason that this was uncovered was because a lot of people in different countries worked together with different data sets to uncover this scenario of fraud. And so, for example, Danish journalists requested EU subsidy data with a right to information law. People used beneficial ownership data from the Slovak Republic. Panama banking data came out through the Panama Papers, and all of this data was also combined with land ownership data in France. And they were able to piece together the fact that Andrej Babiš had connections to owning this chateau in France, and that he had illegally bought it by getting these fraudulent subsidies from the EU. And so now he is being prosecuted at the EU level, and I believe in the Czech Republic. And so obviously this land ownership data was powerful in bringing this act of corruption to light. And this couldn't have been possible unless people worked together to really link these data sets. And it would have been a lot easier to uncover if all of these data sets had common identifiers that allowed people to easily link them together. And so when you are looking at open data for anti-corruption, a huge important piece to remember is that these data sets need to be interoperable. And so, yeah, that is something to remember when we are considering opening land data, is how we can link them to other important high-value data sets.
Indeed, interoperable means that data should be read by machines, not just by humans, because sometimes humans are not really aware of, the ocean of data that might be available out there in the web. But if machines are able to read, and detect this data and bring those together and layering up and produce new insights, new research, new visualizations, this proved to be extremely useful for research and advocacy. But opening data for a purpose means that we support a specific agenda, right, Pamela? So I wanted to ask this question back to you, because it's one of the main findings of your multi-year research. How can, whose agenda is being advanced when open data initiatives are promoted? How can we be careful to that?
This is the tattoo that all open data advocates should have tattooed on their wrist before they think about opening up a data set, right? Whose agenda is being advanced? I think we've had really amazing examples from Nico and from Kristen about the ways in which when open data works the way it should, it can be emancipatory and it can help strengthen democracy and it can support transparency and other open government objectives. We've also talked earlier on about the ways in which open data can support entrepreneurship and innovation. I think it's good to remember too that sometimes open data sets are silly and banal and not that useful. If you search around, you'll find all kinds of data sets where it's very difficult to imagine why or how those things are going to be useful, and they kind of clog up open data portals. I think that open data has the potential on the agenda side to actually do harm. We have to keep talking about this, not to put a damper on the enthusiasm around open data, but to remember that by releasing data, we may be transgressing people's rights. For example, in Canada, there are really important nation-to-nation conversations around Indigenous data sovereignty. And open data is sometimes at odds with the principles of ownership, possession, access, and control by Indigenous communities. And here, our Indigenous communities have different data governance principles too. And so this work is really important, and it's relational, and it takes time to build trust. So we need to remember that sometimes the agenda may be at odds with the human rights of the people that we're working with. On a more positive side, sometimes the agenda helps government work better. One of the things that I always find so surprising is when people advance their open data work and we ask them who their users are. One of the things that we hear over and over and over again, that the biggest users of open data portals put up by government are other users inside the same organization, which is hilarious to me. But it speaks to sometimes the agenda is changing the way governments are wired from the inside by opening things up. But this question of whose agenda, it's a question we just have to keep asking over and over and over again whenever someone asks, whenever we're having to make a priority decision about when to publish with purpose. We need to really think carefully about where we're going to invest our resources and whose agenda we really want to support.
Great, thank you, Pamela. So, and yeah, is data becoming the new oil? Is who is profiting from this open data? All those very burning questions. But let me stay with you, Pamela, and because you edited and co-edited a very important book on the future of open data, which leads us very nicely into the third round of questions for this webinar, the evolution, the future of open data. So this publication looks at the 5 years of research about the Canadian open data community with critical perspectives on what could and should happen as open data efforts evolve. So can you summarize your team's findings, Pamela, and the conclusions for land data in particular?
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief so we have space for our participants to ask questions too. This work in the book that we published, I put a link in the chat for everyone. It's an open access book and it's free. So that was an important value to us. So if it's interesting to you, please download it. There were 26 researchers and 30 partners inside government and inside civil society groups and private sector firms who worked with us over 5 years. And I'll just pick up on 3 things I'm going to highlight. The first thing around the future of open data is that we really need to start to understand how the increasing use of technology in our communities through smart cities or through technology platforms starts to interface with open data work. There's an interesting, all kinds of interesting data that's being gathered by the private sector. And there's a whole bunch of data that we collectively want, but we can't have because it's their proprietary data that's been gathered from public space, for example. And so we need to start to reconcile the open data push with the tremendously valuable and massive data sets that private sector firms are gathering across our communities around the world. It's basically a form of economic rent seeking where they're profiting from public collection. And so governments need to start to figure out how to build those relationships in different ways. I also think that we really need to start to figure out who are we going to bring into the open data ecosystem beyond the obvious open data advocates to try to help more and more people start to engage in open data work. Here in our country, we see tremendous leadership from our public library system. We're really fortunate in Canada that our public libraries are well-resourced and they're appreciated and valued and supported through local governments. But the Toronto Public Library, for example, where I sit on the Innovation Council, is world leading in its efforts around innovation technology and open data and supports the open data community through things like hosting hackathons on an annual basis and continuously trying to bring new things into community. And the value of the library, at least here, is that we have 100 library branches in our city. So the library has the best civic reach of any institution. Organizations like the one I work for, like universities, also have a tremendous role to play because we have access to research capacity, which can help community members work if we have good community university relationships to make those relationships better, to add more value to the data use. And I think, the last thing I'll just say is that we really need to embed an equity lens in the work we're doing around open data. I've talked about it a fair bit, but we can't let that work go. And we need to make sure that this work is embedded from the beginning of the open data work and not a question that's asked at the end. Those are some of the findings of the work that we produced. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I invite all of you to read this really insightful and important publication that summarizes so many years of research and a big group of researchers as well, more than 30 people involved. Really masterpiece. Okay, thank you so much for these extra insights. And Pamela, I wanted to ask the same question to the other panelists. If we look at the future, how do you see the future directions for open data? Tommy.
Thank you, Laura. I want to touch on to one of the questions that was asked from the audience as well. And it's around the issue of indigenous data. And I think one of the things we're going to see going forward with regards to open data, and I think it was mentioned before as well by one of the other speakers, I'm not sure who now, is this issue of data interoperability, but it's also about people interoperability. In other words, the discussion about indigenous data sovereignty, sometimes it's juxtaposed sort of as the opposite or in contrast to open data, when really what we should be talking about is the interoperability of people and data, and that means a discussion around the indigenous data. Because when we talk about indigenous data sovereignty and opening up data or advocating for the opening up data is not carte blanche to invade people's privacy. It's rather to have a conversation as society in what is in the public interest and what part of the public interest outweighs a private interest. But this means a dialogue. It means a conversation to allow people to have trust in one another, trust in the government, trust in the data, because data is not it is neutral, but it's also not neutral. It's highly political. And we're dealing and living in that environment. So I think an interesting aspect discussion of this data conversation going forward is going to be about this principle of building value for all stakeholders, while recognizing the right of stakeholders not to agree, not to participate. And there was another question about, so where does that leave us with regards to land ownership data? And I think we get a bit fixated about publishing who owns what, when there's such a range of land tenure data that can be anonymized and still published, that can still have value. But we must also remember that, in many countries, legal jurisdictions, often cadastral data is public record. It is by law meant to be open and public, precisely to provide transparency for land transactions. So in an analog environment, often the legal frameworks allow open access for this data. And I think where we have seen privacy breaches in the past, it's not been because of open data systems. It's been privacy breaches because of closed data systems, where people don't have insight into the data that is being kept about them, or don't have the right to say, no, I don't want this data to be kept about me. And I think that's an aspect of ownership that open data actually facilitates rather than breaches. So I think we're going to see a lot of conversations around this area in the future. On a more practical note, I think we're going to see a lot more understanding develop and capacity develop, because local data custodians need to have the ability to manage the data. And that is going to be crucial. So capacity building going forward in the open data discussion, in the data community, in the land sector especially, which is lagging behind, that is going to be a huge area going forward. Another area of improvement, I think, that we will see in the next 4 to 5 years is in the development of baselines and monitoring initiatives of openness. So the state of land information products produced by the Land Portal, the Open Up Guide, the Global Data Barometer, they are developing far more precise measures of land data. And this is really an exciting area of development with a more renewed focus on land data and open data going forward. So I think these are some of the exciting interventions that we can look forward to, but it's really going to be about whose data and for what purpose. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of contention and development also in the next 4 years.
Thank you so much, Tommy. And let me just, before I give the floor to Kristen and Nicholas, go back to Pamela quickly, because she referred to the private sector and the tech community, acting as a kind of a first mover, with this advantage of being the first mover and using the open data and the public sector, and the government kind of following, lagging behind somehow. I wanted to ask you one of the questions that the audience posted, which is the challenge of manipulation of data. Can we trust is here. Can you reflect on the context of misuse and abuse of open land data by different actors, and reflect on how to embrace the perspective of the local communities, male and women, and men in developing open data sets? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that, Pamela.
I'll say a little bit, but I suspect other panelists may have ideas too. In the early days of the open data movement, one of the reasons why government was reluctant to release data was they said, without the context, the data may be misused, right? And so this is just an inherent challenge, although I think that people's comfort with getting good data out matters. I think that the challenge is, certainly we've seen here that if data sets are produced and they're inaccurate, the people who watch the data are pretty quick to point out the challenges and for data sets to be updated. At one point in Toronto, we had an open data book club where sometimes governments would bring their data sets that they were about to release to this community of folks who met once a week to talk about open data and to show people the data and to kind of get a peer review of the data before it got released to figure out how to structure it better, but also to kind of get a heads up if there are any issues or challenges with it. And so, I think sometimes data isn't accurate, not for just because it's a messy process of gathering it. When there's nefarious intent with bad data, that's an entirely different piece. And that's where you really need, maybe Kristen can pick up on this, open data as part of a broader open government regime around transparency, access. Those kinds of things really matter because you have to have somebody willing to correct the data set, but it's difficult when data that's been released for bad intent is out there. It's hard to pull it back. So those are very, really important concerns.
Thank you so much, Pamela. And another question, sorry to continue on this, but there are a few very intriguing questions from the audience I would like to address. Keeping, still focusing on the risk of the manipulation of data. How can we trust the integrity of all those that are in charge of publishing this data? Now, especially in jurisdictions where there have been challenges related to the quality of data. Well, you can answer the question, or Tommy can answer, or Kristen or Nicholas, if you feel you can answer this question, please, or you have any good example to share, go ahead.
Why don't the other panelists go first, and if I have something to add, I will.
I think I want to touch on what Pamela said about the quality of the data. I think number one, we must let the users decide whether the quality of the data is appropriate for their needs. So we don't need to babysit the users, and I think there's a lot of emphasis on trying to make sure that the data is perfect before it goes out into the public domain. And I think the public have a great role to play in curating, improving, validating, or rejecting data. And as Pamela said, if data is released with a nefarious intent, that is something else. But often the public agencies and organizations and groups are actually better placed to do the data cleaning, to improve the quality of the data. So what I'm trying to say is opening up data can actually improve the quality of the data rather than relying on a government agency to reach some sort of theoretical aspect of quality and wellness of the data, if you prefer that term, and then making it public. The public should be part of the data process. They're not just passive recipients of government data. They should be partners in a data process that works for them as well as for government.
Anyone else has comments on these points? Of course, releasing land data always bring this issue on the table, no? But the quality of data is not good enough. Or another issue that is very much, very often we hear from when it comes to releasing land data is, okay, but how do you balance land ownership and transparency, and the privacy also, because the land data includes also personal data, which is another question comes from the audience. Is anyone interested to address?
Yeah, I don't have specific answers, but I would say that a key theme that seems to keep coming up is that there's this need for community dialogue in determining what data should be available. So I just want to emphasize OGP is a great mechanism for dialogue when it comes to determining what reforms should be worked on, what information should be available. So if you live in an OGP member country, you can find your point of contact on the OGP website for your country or locality, and you can get involved with your multi-stakeholder forum, and you can share your thoughts on what data should be available and what data should be improved. So just my plug there.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Can I just jump in, hot pursuit that before Tommy goes? I just want to put a call out there. When people were introducing themselves, I saw lots of people who work in the land sector, whether you're surveyors or you're doing land-based planning work. The multi-stakeholder process needs more people who work on and with the land. I served in the inaugural one in Canada, and I was the only one who worked at the sub-state level, and certainly the only one who actually worked in anything land related. So to all the folks that are here listening, if you're looking for a new volunteer opportunity, your state MSF is a really important, they need your expertise around land.
Great. fantastic. And this answered very nicely another question that came from the audience, which is, what would you suggest? We should start with for promoting open data when you operate in a fragile context. How can also fragile, politically, economically fragile. Tommy, you want to add also to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to mention that, for example, in the Open Up Guide process and the SOLI process, the land portal sees, opening up data not as a binary outcome, but as a process. And that process includes and is fundamental to enabling a multi-stakeholder discussion to take place. And I'm keen to emphasize this also for our audience members here, that opening data is not sort of a binary outcome. It is a negotiated and discussion dependent on local circumstances, dependent on legal frameworks, dependent on the quality and the capacity and the availability of data. But the one thing that we have found in many countries is that the availability or the amount of data generally and always exceeds the data that is open and accessible. So we find even that professionals are working digitally and then in some macabre way have to print their data into manual form, maps, lists of coordinates, and then provide that data to the public sector, to government. And then government sits in a situation where it has paid for data to be generated, and that it sometimes has to pay for, again, multiple times. And it's really also just sometimes about making these adjustments to improve the data ecosystem, because and using the opportunities that already exist, rather than focusing on collecting more data, on getting more complete data. Start shifting the thinking about, well, what do we do with the data that we do have? How does that feed into decision making? How can we improve the use of the data that we already have before we start thinking about, well, we need to collect more data that might never see the light of day and that might not be used? Because collecting data in and of itself is of zero value. It's about using data that has value. So even if you collect more data more perfectly and it's not used, it's not made available for use and consumption, I'm sorry, but it's pointless.
This is a good point, Tommy. Very good point. But let me just give the floor also to Nicholas, who's been silent, and one ask him, how do you see the future direction of open land data from your own perspective?
Okay, thank you, Laura. Yes, I would like to go back again to some concept that we're mentioning, that when we talk about the future of open land data, we have to know that open data, and particularly land data, does not exist or operate in a vacuum. There are local legal frameworks, there are local necessities, tradition, etc. Different stakeholders and people involved in the process of opening and using land data that will, let's say, that will define how this process is going to be. But if we have to say, if I had to say something in a general way, I would say that we have seen a lot of examples of these little scarce land data being used. And there are a lot of communities and stakeholders that make their way to analyze land data, even though land data is not very much available at its low quality. So I think that this connected with the connection of the communities interested in land data and the open data tradition and the communities and movements is going to work towards more open data. And also to have this in mind, okay, when we say that we have to take into consideration privacy issues when opening data, or when I see in the chat some concerns of that there were some problems that arise from opening data, I think that we have to go to some basic, as Tommy mentioned. There are land registries or registries are in an analogic way. They are open. It's open information, and if it's not quality when it's open, that's perhaps it's not a high quality before that. So this could be a process to improve the quality of government data that was not open when you open that data. But yes, to summarize, it's not that the only way is this the open by default, or to open everything, is to localize, to analyze local needs, and with this dialogue to find the best way to improve the availability of land data that is, as we have all mentioned, is crucial to address a lot of socioeconomic and environmental challenges.
Thank you so much. It has been a great, really great conversation. And let me just summarize a few key points and take away for these sessions. So it's so important for all of us working on open land data to take into consideration whenever we design open data interventions, the broader socio-political and economic context where we operate. It's also very important that data should be made open for a purpose, but we need also to pay attention to what agenda we serve whenever we design an intervention. And finally, it's so important to foster open land data intervention through multi-stakeholders processes that include the private and the public sector, and really encourage dialogue that among different groups and stakeholders, perhaps using existing mechanisms that have shown to work greatly, such as the OGP mechanism. I also wanted to remind everyone that to please go and download the publications that we have promoted today, Broken Links by the Open Government Partnerships, that has a chapter on land ownership and tenure. Also, Pamela co-edited the book called The Future of Open Data. They are both publicly available and online, so you can download from their websites. And you can also find them on the Land Portal website. And also not to forget that the Data for Development will soon publish these updated, the updates to this the state of open data land chapter. And hopefully you will find it also through the Land Portal. And let me just go for a quick round of final statements from our great panelists today. I'm sorry we didn't manage to answer all the questions. We did address many of them. We didn't manage to answer all of them, but we'll take care of following up with you. And yes, I wanted to go for a very quick round of 30-second statement from our great panelists as your takeaway message from today's discussion. Kristen, you want to start? You are the first on my right.
Sure. So we know based on our findings that there is a lot of room to improve land data in terms of both the content of the information and the format, making sure that it's machine readable, interoperable with other data sets. But we also know that there's also plenty of opportunity for people to get involved and contribute to these dialogues on what data needs to be shared. So find your multi-stakeholder forums, share your input, and hopefully we can get some better data out there.
Great, and we'll look forward to collaborating more closely with OGP on that. Nicholas, what is your takeaway message, your hope for the future of open data on land?
Yeah, I agree that there's a great room from improvement. I also see that there has been a lot of research on land data and open data issues. So we have to combine and be aware of all this new knowledge around the topic, and to have a good foundations for the work forward to having more and better open land data.
Fantastic, thank you, Nicholas. The next on my right is Tommy. Do you also have a message you want to share with the audience today?
Thank you, Laura. I think what became clear today is that when we're talking about data, we're actually talking about for what the purpose for which we are opening the data, the service that we are trying to provide or enable. And then the second thing that we picked up today is that equity and justice are not automatic outcomes of opening data. They can be, but this needs to be deliberate. This needs to be the goal. Equity and justice needs to be the goal. Thirdly, we must not ignore the political drivers and the political context. Data is supposed to be neutral, but information is political. And we need to understand this. And then finally, I think as much as we've talked about data interoperability, we need to think about people interoperability as well. And I think this is a process of creating trust. So those are my 4 takeaways for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And while I head to Pamela, and because I also seen questions from our colleagues that are attending the climate summit these days in Egypt, and also colleagues from the UNCCD land degradation neutrality are also for refocusing their interventions, taking more seriously into consideration land issues. Let me ask you for concluding this question to Pamela, how can land data, Pamela, continue to support sustainable development for everyone?
Well, the two of you just queued up what I was going to say, and this wasn't planned, which is it's really important for all of us who are in leadership roles in open data efforts to stack the impact of your effort. So when you're publishing with purpose, prioritize things that contribute to dealing with the climate emergency. Prioritize efforts that support people's basic access to housing rights and land tenure. Prioritize people having access to things like clean water and food security. You know, if you have to make difficult decisions, double down on the ones that make the difference to the people who are the most vulnerable, but have the most impact for the widest range of people, including with the climate emergency.
Thank you so much. This was great. Conclusions, great concluding remarks, Pamela. And I hope we can join forces all together to have more data, more land data, more publicly and openly accessible to really contribute to a more sustainable development for all. Thank you for participating in this webinar. It's been great conversations, great questions, and a great also audience. Thank you to the panel again, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.